And good morning. Welcome to the Old School, a podcast about many things, not least of which education, but also culture, music, arts, philosophy, religion, as it happens today. I am Ross Miller, along with Dr. Stephen Bourgeois. Good morning, Dr. Bourgeois.
Hello, Mr. Miller. Good to see you this morning. You
How are
seem,
you?
I'm good. You seem sort of perky, wide awake on a Saturday. I don't know what's going on here.
Well, drugs help. No, it's plenty of sleep for a change. It helps as well. But with us today is the Reverend Dr. Jason Valendy and Estee Valendy. They are co-pastors at Keller United Methodist Church in Keller, Texas. Good morning, Pastors Valendy.
Good morning.
Have you ever come up with like a, not like Benifer, but have you ever come up with like a single name that kind of encapsulates both of y'all? Or
We have. It's called Estee and the guy riding her coattails. We've been that for years. So it's really good.
you're the trophy husband. Is that what?
I'm just
Estee's
loud
brains
one.
and
Yeah.
you're loud.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. We appreciate the invitation and excited to engage in conversation with you and topic at hand. But most importantly, thanks for the work that y'all have been doing these past couple of years. We had an opportunity to look back at some of the catalog that you've done, some of the pieces around education. The 2-part series around sandwiches was also quite good. So
Good.
those are some deep cuts. If you've got some listeners, that was a really great. Anyway, I digress.
Wow.
Thanks for the invitation.
You're the one person who liked the second sandwich episode. I think most people are willing to go with us on the first one. I think when it led into a second episode is when we started losing people, perhaps.
We made it to the ends and had to hang up the call. So
Well, just one episode is just one part of the bun. You have to have a second episode to complete the sandwich. That's just how it works. So it wouldn't have worked.
You know, metaphorically, that could be the way we explain that from here on
There
out.
you go.
So, well, Jason Valendy he first came to prominence on the soccer pitch, giving off vibes of a younger Johann Cruyff. However, his true calling was in the ministry, and Essie's first love was music. You had a degree in sacred music, is that correct? At Southwestern?
Right. I do. Sacred music. Mm-hmm.
And so is that all types? Is that mainly Christian? And how far back does that go? What is the emphasis on something like sacred music?
Yeah, Christian music.
Yeah.
I had to take all the music history classes, and it builds on the history. So from Gregorian chant, we studied all that to the classics to where we are today.
We have two musicians in the group because Steve, of course, is an accomplished pianist and has played many years in churches and bars and just about every place that'll have them. So
and actually within about 12 hours of each, because I used to play in bars, restaurants on Saturday night till rather late. Then I was the director of music at New Hope Lutheran for about 15 years in 2 different stints there. And that was getting up early and getting my mind right to lead the praise team for 2 services after playing very late. So I did double duty, but I enjoyed both.
Awesome.
appealing to the masses on all levels. But so I have a tip to start us out. I want to start us out with something perhaps a little bit light, a little bit easy, or perhaps not. So I don't know if you know, but there's a presidential historian by the name of Doris Kearns Goodwin. And among all of her books that she's written about presidential historians, she also wrote a book called Wait Until Next Year. And it talks about her upbringing as a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. And one of the things that she accounts in her story is going to her priest and going to confession, asking for forgiveness because she one time hoped that the New York Yankees bus would crash and they would all have like broken legs and broken arms. And she asked the priest if there's something inherently wrong with her, and the priest answered he thought God understood. I'm wondering how, as ministers, you would approach somebody who had kind of a similar type of dilemma. How would you treat that? I mean, we have a former athlete here, Essie. I don't know your athletic prowess or your interest in athletics, but how would you address something like this?
I love
Or does
first,
God understand? Does that work?
yeah, first off, you're very kind to say that I was very athletic, but and Esty was also quite the athlete when she was in high school, and not only in swimming, but she has really great stories of how to get out of running cross country events.
Yeah.
She's a gold medalist in avoiding the
Running.
runs. Yeah. Yeah,
She's
that's interesting that she would pray that the Yankees would demise before they got to the game as a
not die, but just like
sure
broken your legs.
broken leg.
Painfully
Yeah.
injured.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as a Ranger fan, as a Texas Ranger fan, if you're gonna pray for the broken legs of any team, I think the Yankees are okay. I think you can
Yeah.
pray for them to have broken legs. I think God's a Ranger fan. That's what I'm getting at.
I would say that the Houston Astros deserve some type of retribution for what they did.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
The righteous indignation.
Absolutely.
The offense
Yeah.
to God.
We're supposed
That
to
is the
forgive.
Houston Astros.
Yeah, it's never really bothered me that that you see people like will like credit God at the end of like a touchdown, or like they'll have some sort of big win or something, and they'll credit God. That's never really been a thing that's bothered me. Although, I recognize that at least within the Christian realm, God's got lots of other things to kind of deal with other than finding you a touchdown or a parking spot. But but part of Christianity also suggests that God cares about the specific and the particular. And so, not that God caused the parking spot or the touchdown, but that God would care about you or me. Like that, for me, that's really good news. Like God cares about the small, every hair on my head. Well, I don't have much hair, but that God cares for every hair. His eye is on the sparrow, as the song goes. And there's something quite beautiful about recognizing God's immanence in our lives, not just transcendence. I don't know if Esty would have anything to kind of add to prayers of people wishing to be hurt so that their team would win.
I am not the biggest sports fan, so I think I just don't get it. So it's like, why would you care that much about? It's just a game. I don't know, but yeah.
Sometimes that's all we have, so.
Part inventory is a good thing to do.
Let me ask you this question. I have a couple of questions of this ilk, and before we get into the serious topic, I might leave one towards the end so we can end on maybe a lighter note. But I am curious, what happens when a person becomes a minister or starts down that path of a minister? Do you find that certain friends kind of fall away and other people maybe come to you in your world? I mean, because I would think it's a little bit like, because they knew you before you were a minister, it's like being a leader, and you were once a part of the group. Now you're the leader of the group, and now relationships are different or change. How is that dynamic like when you go from being one of the gang to one of the gang who's also now a minister? Does that change any of the dynamics between yourself and your friends or your friend circle?
We were really young when we went in the ministry. I mean, I went from undergrad right into seminary. So, and in undergrad, a lot of my friends were going in the ministry. I kind of hung with that crew. So it's hard to know. It is a conversation stopper when you're somewhere and you're starting to talk with somebody, and then sometimes they don't know what to do with that. Hard to make new friends. Sometimes. Yeah, I think making new friendships is tricky. Jason, I don't know how your high school friends felt about you going in the ministry, if they would have seen that path for you or not.
Oh, good God, no. Yeah, yeah. No, I was I think that I would imagine it's similar. I'm guessing it is similar in the education world, in that when you're a educator and then you go from educator to like department chair, right? And so yeah, you're and to kind of build on the metaphor that we highlighted earlier around sports, it feels, I would think, kind of akin to becoming like a player coach, where you're moving into relationship with this other group. But yeah, you have to navigate that as an individual, but the team or the church or the peers, they also have to be willing to do that with you. And if there's no like collective endeavor to work on that project, it's just not going to last. So a big part of what becoming a pastor, at least in the United Methodist tradition, is that the local church has to endorse you. You can't just go online and say, I'm going to be a pastor. You can't, it's not a solo endeavor. You know, it actually comes out of the desire of, you can't do this on your own. You can't be a player coach without a team. Right. And we are invested in this process with you. And so, I don't know if do you all have many experiences of moving from, yeah, like an educator to department head or some equivalent thereof? I mean, is that something that you all have experience with as well? It feels similar.
Yeah, I've always, been a teacher I was for about 20 years before I moved into, I guess you'd call it an assistant principal, but it was kind of a dual role. So I did still teach classes. Eventually I became an executive director where I was kind of part of evaluating principals through my work in doing research, and it is a shift. As soon as you're responsible for them, you're not one of them. I mean, I think that it's more awkward for someone like a vice principal in a high school who was teaching there last year, and now they have a clipboard and they're walking around, and it's just so it's probably a challenging transition for them, and the rest of the crew is probably going to look at them differently. It seems to, take about a year before they change roles.
When I was at Keller High School, I had only been there about half a year before I became department chair. And so I think to some degree, my path was probably a little bit easier, at least in regards to that last stop, because, typically, like in the military, when I was in the military, they used to have a rule that, you know, the units were broken up into squads and into platoons and companies and what have you. And typically, if they're going to elevate someone to like a squad leader or a company leader or what have you, they send them to another group. Because I think one of the problems is that the people that you were with when you were just an ordinary Joe, they all have their own thoughts as to whether you deserve the position that you have now risen to. And so they're going to have knowledge of you before you were trying to get your stuff together, or, whatever the case may be. And so it can sometimes make that difficult. The same thing I think happens with department chair. As I said, mine was not quite as a dramatic of a shift because I'd only been there a semester before I became the department chair. And so, but still, that semester prior to, I was not thinking I was going to be a department chair. That was something that kind of came all of a sudden later on. And so you're not necessarily thinking of yourself and your interactions with people in terms of, I'm the future department chair and I need to talk in this particular way. So I think there's always going to be, I think there's always kind of an innate sense of tension when someone rises above the group that they used to be a part of and then becomes the quote unquote leader, even though department chairs really don't have a lot of authority, but they certainly have more authority, or they are privy to more information or more decisions than the average Joe.
In the Christian tradition that we're a part of, it notes that clergy are set apart, right? And I think that to your question, what my experience has been, that tension has been understanding of what does the phrase "to be set apart" mean. And there seems to be a split in that some folks tend to think that to be set apart means to be superior or better than, whereas others interpret to be set apart as just as a different purpose, right? Not necessarily better or worse, just for a different purpose. And we do this instinctively. I think when I grew up, there was my regular clothes that I wore. I wore, tennis shoes all week. And then on Sunday, I had Sunday shoes. I wore those shoes on Sunday. And then frankly, they weren't better shoes. We kind of tongue in cheek say our Sunday best, but they weren't better shoes. In fact, they were really uncomfortable. But I only wore those shoes on Sunday. They were set apart for a particular purpose. And so my experience has been the tension of when people discover that I believe clergy are set apart for a particular purpose versus clergy are set apart because they're superior. And when people discover that clergy, that Estee and I think that clergy are set apart for a particular purpose, it's really liberative. People are like, oh, you're like a regular person. You go to the grocery store. You do all the things that I do. Yes, we do. We are set apart for a particular purpose. We are not set above to lord it over. Again, Jesus says, you will not lord over the others, right? But you will be set apart. And so to kind of get at that question, that's been the biggest kind of insight that I've experienced over the years, is it kind of distilling back down to how do people understand being, quote, set apart, and the tension that lies within. And so it creates an instant teaching moment as well.
Well, to take this to a broader scope, and maybe a central question of the episode, maybe organically move on to something else. Nowadays, by latest accounts, there are over 1 billion Catholic Christians. There's over 1 billion Protestant Christians. Depending on numbers, there are over 250 million Orthodox Christians. There are those who suggest that that religion in general and Christianity in particular are doing well. The numbers would suggest that, but others would also suggest that that's just numbers. That doesn't necessarily suggest adherence or congregants or whatever the case may be. I'm wondering, to what extent do you think Christianity is doing well in general, or not doing well? And in particular, there's this feeling that a lot of people are moving towards more traditional. You hear about the growth of Islam, you hear about the growth of Buddhism, you hear about all these different. It's hard to know what's genuine, what's trendy, what's serious, what's frivolous, or what have you. But I'm wondering where you see the Christian church at this particular point.
Everything we're told by our denominational leadership is that Christendom is on the decline. The rise of the nuns, the rise of those who are unaffiliated with any kind of religion. Think about like England. I don't know what I was reading recently about. It was England or Scotland, and people are more secular. Secularists are the majority now in what used to be a Christian nation. So I think everything. All the signs that I'm told are that it's on the decline, but sometimes you wonder if things need to die to be reimagined, and that's okay. But lots of what we think of culturally as Christian, is that really the heart of the matter? Just because you go to church, does that really mean that it makes a difference in here? So I don't know. I'm not afraid of decline, but I do think it is happening from what I see.
Mm-hmm. I think the premise of the question is somewhat interesting in that it's assuming that kind of the goal of Christianity is to propagate maybe churches or to propagate the religion, whereas I'm not sure that that's the case, right? My reading of scripture, Jesus says that the kind of the goal is to help usher in the kingdom of God, right? Or the reign of God, or some people say, the kingdom of God. There's different phrasings around this, right? So I would argue or submit that Christianity, or the tenets of Christianity, have been incredibly successful in helping usher in the reign of God in ways that we now kind of just take for granted. Even though we no longer classify it as uniquely, quote, Christian, it comes out of that. So For instance, in the days of the Roman Empire, if you were somebody with crippled legs, nobody cared about you. They didn't build buildings to accommodate you. You know what I mean? You just made it or you didn't. And nowadays, try to build a building without ADA compliance. It's actually a part of the cultural zeitgeist and understanding of how we care for one another, that perhaps Christianity has been incredibly successful in her ability to be like a mustard tree, right? And to be in the ground and immersed in such a way that now folks, it's just kind of part of it. So maybe numerically, the kind of traditional or institutional church is on a numeric decline, but the cultural impact of helping usher in a deeper an awareness and care and concern for the victims and for the marginalized and the concern, I don't know how we can call that on the decline or in any way Christianity is really failing in that capacity. Look around. I mean, look around. There is a deep, deep concern for the marginalized, for those on the outskirts in ways that historically, now I'm not a historian, you guys are much more inclined in that. I'd be willing to bet that ancient Carthage didn't care, about large swaths of people. And yet here we are having debates about, is capital punishment right or wrong? And that was just taken for granted. Of course it's fine and we should do it, a long time ago. So I would say that the Christianity has been incredibly successful and perhaps is even on the rise the more that we see a care and concern for victims and the marginalized.
When you consider how other people though view it, because Estee, you mentioned that the message you get from on high is that it's on the decline, and I think your distinction about what is the end goal of Christianity as a faith, as a religion, is an interesting one. But I think most people would view it as, like any faith, that the purpose of a faith is to influence and to spread, as far as the ideas, if not the particulars of faith, then at least the influence. Yes, and I think one of the things that sets Christianity apart, Christianity was the first one that really kind of emphasized charity. The Jews had a sense of charity, but it was typically amongst Jews, mainly because no one else cared about them, and so they were kind of inclusive that way. Christianity was the first one to kind of develop the notion of charity that extended out to people who were not like them, who were different from them, who and usually know nothing to kind of separate who received aid and who did not receive aid. So if you accept the idea that many people see the growth or the shrinking of a faith by numbers, I'm wondering, Estee, you were saying that this is the attitude that you're getting from above. What do they view, in your mind, your opinion, what do they view as hurting the church? So if we just take away the idea of talking about numbers, what hurts the church? What helps the church?
I think scandals hurt the church. You hear about leaders who fail with some frequency, and that doesn't just hurt that church. I think it hurts the church overall. I think Christian nationalism hurts the church. What would the leadership of the United Methodist Church say right now? I think that they would say that we are not, we don't tell our story enough. That we're not very invitational. We're not inviting people. We're not making opportunities to bring people in. Methodism kind of arose as a frontier movement, like this tent revival thing. And it was and so we've gone pretty far from those kinds of days. What else would they say hurts the church? Yeah.
How would you define Christian nationalism? You mentioned that as something that hurts the church. How would you define that? I'm not sure of the term.
And I'm not an expert. I think Christian nationalism is a conflation of the ideals of respect for the nation and the Christian church. I think there's a fine line of idolatry when we have flags in sanctuaries and things like that. I mean, we love America, and I'm proud to live here, and I'm proud of my family members who have served, but America is not God. They're not, God and America are not the same thing. God is as concerned for other nations as he is for this nation. I don't know. Jason is probably a lot more verbose about this topic than I am.
Well, being verbose doesn't necessarily mean I'm accurate. Yeah, I think that Christian nationalism, my experience has been that it's not just that that like a theocratic form of government, but also this notion that if you're not Christian, then we will make you Christian. And so it's not just that Christianity should be privileged; it's that Christianity should be prioritized as above all things. And so you see that play itself out in lots of different ways. And then the argument, at least within the Christian circles, is, well, let's just say, even if you think that's a good idea, which I don't, but let's just say you do, what form of Christianity gets to have? There's lots of expressions of Christianity. So it's not just Christian nationalism that's problematic, but even like how we're defining the term and what expression of Christianity takes precedent. But yeah, I agree with Estee. We experience a lot of critiques and feedback that we hear around the nature and function of the church that's participating and helping promote its kind of decline. I would add that the church is really, really, really quite good at explaining and articulating and painting a really vivid picture of bad news. We preachers are actually trained in that's called homiletics. We're trained. One way to do a sermon is to speak about a problem, or to kind of complexify and speak really completely about a problem, the bad news, and then at the end of the sermon, like the last fourth of the sermon, proclaim the good news. Mm-hmm. So even if you think that that's a good form of a structure for preaching, you've got 3/4 of the sermon dedicated to bad news and 1/4 of the sermon dedicated to good news. So just over time, 3/4 of the time in worship, we're talking bad news. I mean, good gosh, who wants to be a part of that? Like I can sit around and paint bad news all day long. I go to church and participate in a communion to hear good news. And you're only giving me 15 minutes out of an hour of good news? I think part of our problem is we've gotten so good at painting bad news that we have forgotten, like Estee said, to tell our story, but actually to proclaim good news in vivid, concrete, and clear ways, in the same way that we are able to clearly and concretely paint bad news.
Well, I think the Christian nationalism is definitely chasing people away. Gives them bad taste. The nations are as a drop in the bucket, right? And we forget that, and certainly it's not. I mean, putting it with the United States, it's immediate turnoff. I think maybe we're even underestimating how many people are going their own way, but just because of that, and it's we're bringing not only nationalism but politics into the church, which is coming to me almost a line in the sand. That's a place where you shouldn't have that.
I might push back a little bit on that. In that, I think that Jesus was pretty political. I think what I'm hearing, though, is that politics isn't necessarily the problem. It's the partisanship that becomes problematic.
Right. There you go.
So like preaching good news to the poor, that's a political act, right? Or standing with, the marginalized. There's a lot of politics within the prophets, but it's the partisanship that creates problems. And I think not to nitpick with words, but I'm under the impression that it's the partisanship that creates the problems, where I don't feel welcomed if I don't vote a particular way, because the persons up front are saying, if I vote the way I want to vote or act the way I feel God calling me to act, that I'm somehow unchristian, or perhaps even, a heathen, or going to hell, or whatever it might be. So the partisanship and negative partisanship creates significant problems. I would agree with that.
It's a difficult path, because when you consider the history of the church and churches, whether it is getting involved to help out the poor, whether it's involved to help out orphans, whether it's involved, you think about the Christian socialist movement, Walter Rauschenbusch in the late 1800s, and the idea of not talking about Christ, but showing Christ. Whether you're talking about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there are plenty of examples of the Christian church, at least, weighing in on social matters that become political issues. How do you walk that line, though? Because maybe it is a question of just politics as opposed to partisanship, but are there places where the church has a natural purview to be involved in, and are there areas that they don't?
Yeah, I mean, Scripture provides, I think, for at least the Christian scriptures and Hebrew scriptures, for that matter, provide a pretty clear rubric to point to which areas should be prioritized, and that is care for the widow, the orphan, the sojourner, or the immigrant. Like, so if you do nothing else, perhaps start there. There are a ton of biblical mandates and examples that in the positive, where the faithful respond to the widow, orphan, and immigrant or sojourner. And there are examples where the faithful do not respond well. And perhaps the entire book of Exodus and the entire prophets are hinged around how the faithful do or do not engage with those three classes of peoples. Some version of that, exists today. Widows, orphans, and sojourners have different, at least in the United States, have a different set of structures, social services that didn't exist then, that exist now. But that doesn't mean that the churches can now be, in absentia to those concerns. But that becomes, I would suggest, the toehold. And if churches start there, I'm fairly confident that the work of God in those churches will show them the next right step for that place to be socially, politically engaged in faithful ways. So if we're starting at presidential politics and school board elections, if we're starting with positions of power, that's probably not the right first step. I would say it probably begins with care for the widow, orphan, sojourner. And then when you have that credibility, then you're able to speak truth to power.
How much pressure do you feel to weigh in on stuff like that as leaders of the community, as, co-pastors of a very large church? I mean, how much pressure do you feel?
It's a fine, a hard line to walk all the time. Yeah, it's awful. I don't like it. A lot of feel like you're letting people down if you don't say something. But if you do say something, then everybody else can be mad. So it's always weighing, what is this worth it?
Yeah, I like that. Tell the truth, but tell it slant.
Emily, good job.
Emily Dickinson. There you are. Yeah. Yeah. So like that notion of being able to speak to something, the most direct way to speak to something is actually indirectly, right? And so the pressure that I feel to speak to an issue is helpful because it provokes me to use some creative energies to say, cool, how can I most directly speak to this in an indirect way that actually lowers the defenses and perhaps unclogs ears so people can hear? I'm not saying that they have to agree, but just so that they can hear. And so if that pressure to speak to the pressing issues of the day were not in my life, I'm not sure that I would use energy. I would have the energy to find creative ways to speak to the issue indirectly. I would just be kind of lazy and just say, and speak to it real directly and immediately create a division, right? For those of you who don't know, Estee and I actually grew up at this church that we serve now. We baptized, we got married. I mean, we have deep roots in this particular congregation, which, if you know anything about the story of Jesus, not that we're Jesus, but Jesus does have a story where he goes to his hometown and preaches and teaches and heals. And the people are like, yeah. And they run him out, and he says, well, a prophet's not welcome in his hometown. So like there is something about being able to speak to something directly. The most direct way to do that is indirectly. And I feel that pressure to speak to things. I get emails both before and after
Mm.
things. And so I'm grateful for that pressure, and I'm at my best. And I think preachers are at their best when they can harness that pressure for creative outlets to create parables and stories and speak to it directly via an indirect path. Yeah.
It's not unlike what Ross does teaching history, and because he deals with politics all the time, but he's pretty adept at getting the most out of the learning by not necessarily taking a position or taking a position as so that it can be argued against. But that takes some finesse for sure.
It takes trust, takes relationships. And that's why a preacher, the role of a pastor isn't just confined to preacher. You have to be a pastor too. You have to know your people and let them know that you care. When life is hard for them, you reach out so that you have that baseline of trust that you build from. So when you do have to say something hard, they're more apt to receive it. So a lot of the work, I think, of pastoring is caregiving and trust building. And then in the right times, you can say things, but you can't just say things.
I study the desert mothers and fathers of the late antiquity period, and I find them fascinating. These are
Can you
folks that
explain
live.
what that is a little bit?
Yeah, they're proto-monastics. They're like people before there was like monastic traditions. These were the people that kind of figured out how to do that. They lived on the outskirts of towns or sometimes deep in the deserts of Syria and Egypt. And they were withdrawing from society or engaging, not withdrawing, but engaging with society in a different way. And one of the ways they were trying to like help society move along is they genuinely thought that they were helping their town, their society, by moving out into the deserts where the demons were. So they thought that they were being helpful protectors, and so folks could come and bear witness to these holy ones, both male and female, and learn a bit of wisdom, or they would say, "Teach me a word." And so these words or sayings were then orally, remembered and then collected and then eventually written down. And we have these what are called the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers, or the Abbas and the Ammas. But one of the sayings of the desert Abbas and Ammas is the adult or the master, the Abba, says to another student, "Be sure to be their example, not their legislator." And so it's a way of how do you speak? How do you teach? Well, if you do it directly by legislating or dictating or doing imperatives, that's not helpful. But be their example, be the model first. So to Estee's point, it's not one of the most direct ways to speak to a political issue is to embody that example first. So if you think that it's important, for instance, for people to care for the widow, orphan, and sojourner, in what way are you as a clergy person engaged with the widow, orphan, and sojourner? So it starts inwardly and outwardly. Be their model, not their legislator.
That's a counter to the old, I don't know if it was meant to be a joke or what have you, that teachers explain and preachers proclaim, the idea that it's not just about, standing on high like you're Moses with the tablets, but rather, being down with the group and kind of leading by example, as it were. Both of y'all were talking about the notion about how Christians tell their story and express themselves and how that they project themselves out. Jason, a while back, you wrote a blog post that talked about that said we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. I'm wondering to what extent does that play a role? Because we are in the kind of a mega church kind of a phase of Christian history. Not that that's either good nor bad, but do you think that helps Christianity in the same way that the gigantic cathedrals of Europe helped? Do you think that hurts more? or how do you feel that people kind of interact with that?
Well, I think that I would defer to Estee to start, because that quote actually isn't mine, right?
Hmm?
That
Yes,
comes from
Winston
Winston
Churchill.
Churchill,
Yes.
right? And the history around, the building of Parliament after it was destroyed, and those individuals, the Parliament, the MPs facing one another, and what that meant. And I don't know if he actually said that or if it's apocryphal. I don't exactly know, but it's a great line. But Esty actually has some more kind of experience around, architecture and how it forms and shapes. I don't, Esty, did you want to speak to?
Oh, I've never thought about how the structure of a mega church shapes Christianity as I think. Oh, I don't want to be too critical. I think it's awful though. um
You can
because
say that. That's what we're waiting for to get it.
Drives up ratings.
That's right.
mainline Protestant and Catholic, we call the space we worship in a sanctuary. In a big non-denominational church, they call it an auditorium. It's just and it's a different space. There aren't any windows. It's enclosed. It's dark. There are lights, and it feels like a show. If there's a high entertainment value, I think because they want people to come and be engaged and come back. They want to hook you and make you feel something in that worship experience. But you are solely a observer. You're being entertained. There's hardly any participation in an auditorium. You're there to watch. You're there to see a show, and that's not, in my opinion, what worship is. Worship is work of the people. There is a preacher and we have something to say, but it's like there's an engagement that the worshiper is supposed to have with what's happening, so that it changes you, so that you're sent back into the world in your daily life to be changed. So, yeah. But then you think about medieval. So I have a whole lesson I've done about how, the space of a medieval cathedral kind of shaped those worshipers. In medieval times, worship was in Latin. People didn't speak Latin. The priest had his back to them for a lot of the service, speaking Latin. And so the common worshiper's experience was formed by the windows. That's why stained glass windows are as beautiful as they are, because they told stories. And so people would look at the windows. I don't know. It still was not an ideal kind of worship setting. I don't think people were engaged in worship in medieval times any more than they were in a non-denominational church today. So church persevered through that. But I think that's a really interesting question, Ross. Those are kind of my first insights.
I don't have a lot of experience with, those settings. I don't know if you guys know, but we're usually busy Sunday mornings to be able to have time to go to these spaces. However, just from a like a formation standpoint, one of the interesting things I do think about, as Esty and y'all are kind of suggesting around these auditorium spaces, is that when you walk into it, it does create the sense that you can be anonymous. That you can kind of be hidden in some ways. There's, the lights are always kind of down. And if there's lights to be had at all, it's up, up on not on the communion area, right, but on the stage or whatever. And so you can kind of be lost in the sea of people, right? And so you can become anonymous. And there's something really liberating about that. There's something, when you've gone to a concert and everybody's, singing, at the top of their lungs, like, I get that. But it also creates, I would argue that it also creates the opportunity to feel as though you could kind of get by with the bare minimum. It actually seems to depress accountability and responsibility when you can become anonymous. Which is why, on Facebook, or on not Facebook, but on like social medias or like the comment sections, the most courageous people in the world are the anonymous ones. The most hurtful, harmful people are the anonymous ones. And so worship spaces that create a sense where you can be anonymous, where you can be in the dark, like there's a lot of biblical themes here that, we're kind of pinging on. You're in the dark, you're part of a group or a mob, right? All of these things can be redemptive, I believe. But on the day in and day out, as it forms and shapes, I do wonder if these actual worship spaces actually promote irresponsibility, because every Sunday you're allowed to be anonymous in the presence of, a worship space, and therefore actually eschewing any sense of personal accountability or responsibility to the whole, because you can't see them. We're all in the dark. They can't see you. It's you know what I mean? You can just be anonymous. And so I would think that Jacques Derrida has this idea that religion is responsibility or it's nothing. Like that's the core of what religion is to grow in responsibility to others, to self, to God. So I wonder if the performative or the worship spaces that you're describing in the non-noms actually depress responsibility by accentuating being anonymous.
I think that theory would hold up, and people do vote with their feet. And so you build a big church with a big parking lot and a nice daycare for the kids, and it gets filled up. So it's meeting a need, certainly. A lot of it is convenience.
Mm-hmm. Right. And they
It's
come to our
convenient.
churches and they might think it's boring. And so even if it's that's hard because you want to get them there. You don't want them to not come back. So how do you yeah, how do you give them something that is flavorful?
Well, speaking to something that both the good Reverend Estee and the esteemed Dr. Bourgeois might have a good knowledge of, I'm wondering how music in church has changed as far as what was the original purpose of it to begin with when you had all these monks singing and these monotonic kind of Gregorian chant stuff to what we have today. Is it that much different? Does it, because I must admit, I hate to say this, Estee, I must admit that I gravitate towards the sermon, not necessarily towards the music. And so I'm curious as to how that's developed over the years. Your education and your bailiwick deals with music. How would you describe that?
It's supposed to be, I think of music as like learning languages or whatever that model is, or how different people learn different ways, right? Some people are verbal, or some people are auditory, and some people are musical. And so the best music has the theology in the words and in almost in the melody. There's some kind of complexity about it. And so it's another way of gaining understanding and expressing worship. I think about Martin, like in the development of Christian music. Martin Luther was huge. That is who put the music that you sung in church into kind of common language. He started to write a bunch of hymns. That's where things really changed. I don't know. What I would love to hear, Stephen, what are your thoughts to that question?
Well, being spending a lot of Sundays in a Lutheran church, there's always the liturgy, and to me that was my favorite part. So, but still, I enjoyed creating the services and what music would be used. But initially, it's setting the tone, but it all culminates with communion, and so you're building toward that. And then at the end, I guess the philosophy that we use was to you leave with something, with one thought, and you take it with you. But a coherent service, as opposed to things that are just to entertain. It actually fits in, and it's planned with the service, with the sermon, and in fact the pastor has a lot to do while the music's going. They're not just sitting down. They're sometimes they'll ask you should continue and so forth. So, but I think overall, the liturgy was always my favorite part of that, because there was a comfort in that, and it was consistent week to week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we've just recently added communion at our traditional 11 o'clock, 11:15 service. And that was a way too late addition on our part. But for years, they only had communion once a month because that was just the tradition of the church. But yeah, it's supposed to build toward that. That's historic. I mean, that's how Christian worship has been forever and ever and ever. Amen. Um, I like sung liturgy. I don't know. That's just my preference. I'd love it. I think it just adds so much depth and beauty and light. I can't imagine worship without music.
But those are the high points, and and also after the offering, transitioning from whatever you're playing into the doxology. And I'm an improviser. I'm a jazz musician, so taking whatever is happening during music during the offering and then building it slowly until you hit the doxology and everybody rises to their feet. And that's always a moment as a musician that very creative and wonderful place in the service for that.
Wow. Do you play the organ? What would you play?
Piano, but electric piano. In fact, I had another pianist with me, a wonderful pianist, and so we kind of joined forces there. But those transitions were wonderful.
Oh, that takes so much creativity because you're in one key. You've got to figure out how to modulate over. I don't think people realize all the work that goes on inside a musician's head to make those transitions. So it sounds seamless.
Yeah, you need to end up in the key of G, right?
It is strange. I think my preference for the sermon is in part due to the fact that I'm just incompetent creatively in that way musically, and I'm a little bit jealous, to be frank. When I see Steve able to seamlessly just riff on the piano for about 30 minutes, and that's a short session for him, or just when I hear people with musical talent. I love music, but I'm so incompetent towards the ability and the talent of music that it's quite shameful, really. And so, I always say I'm Jewish. We just never have to gift for music, but I can't even say that because there's been many amazingly talented Jewish musicians, but it's just one of those things where it's like when people talk about baseball. When they say they hate baseball, you can tell there's a level of it that's almost like they wish they loved it. They're hurtful to themselves that they don't love it. And when I say that music is not necessarily my thing from a church standpoint, it's more that I just lack the ability to appreciate it the way others do.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm with you, Ross. I'm not a big music person, but being married to a music person has helped me come to see that one of the gifts that music provides is so like in a sermon, there's one voice and it's monotone, the preacher's doing the thing. And so we all are on that tempo and tone. We're singing that note, if you will. Like that's what we're singing. Or like Gregorian chant, like it's all one, well, I don't know, it's like one unison. We're all singing in unison. But as we've developed and there's been a multiplicity of thought and we live in a very cosmopolitan part of the world, there has to be an expression of how do we have unity without uniformity. And music is actually a really easy, clever example of how you can be unified without having uniform belief or even action. I can sing I can't sing very well. I can tootle along on a range and still participate in the unity of the song without having to be a soprano, or whatever, right? So I find particularly today in the year 2024, music is really helpful for people to understand how can we possibly be together and be unity if we all don't think alike, right? How is it possible that we can all be in this room and not have all the same beliefs? Otherwise, we're not in unity. And I would say that music is a really helpful metaphor to help people see that, yes, we actually can be unified through the process of harmony. And so music, at least from a spiritual formation standpoint, regardless if you sing along or not, has worked on me, even as a non-musician, to form and shape me as one being open to what does unity really, if you will, sound like in a world that's so bifurcated, trifurcated, and atomized into echo chambers of monotonous, usually male voices baritoning away on their tribes. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, music has really, really been helpful. And I'm grateful for the way that Estee brings music into this house, even though our 16-year-old sometimes bemoans it.
Well, it's interesting. We had the same dynamic. My wife's very musical. My sister-in-law is an opera singer, and I have all these musical things that came with the joining with my wife, and you realize how much you lack when you find that partner. And so I totally understand where you're coming from. I knew this was going to happen. We were going to get to about an hour of doing this, and I have still like 50 questions that I wish I could ask y'all. And so I hope that this is not the last time that we have a chance to talk, because you two are so incredible. You're so wonderful to talk to. You're so knowledgeable in your fields. And there's only so much I can listen to Steve, so it
Wait a minute.
it helps
Take
to
a
bring
shot
him.
at me this late in the show. I was about to say real nice things about everybody. And here goes Ross. I really do wish we could have done this in person, and Ross kind of discussed maybe doing that, but it would be good to see you all in person as well. But this has been really fun. Great to meet you, and I do hope that you come back. And that's a open offer, but we'll also just plain ask you sometime if because we'd like to continue the conversation.
We'd love to. We're honored to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. If I don't know if your audience has purchased or read the book that you all have co-authored and wrote, but if I can offer a quick plug, it really is a very good read, even as a non-educator, to hear how insiders can not only promote and critique the systems that they so deeply love. I mean, I don't want to be too romantic about it, but I did read it, even in its biting moments, as kind of a love letter to the teaching profession, a real desire for the field of education to reclaim the beauty of what can happen in the classroom. And some of that means we've got to prune away some of these pedagogies that are popular but are in no way helpful. So if you haven't read it, contact Ross or Steve, and they'll give you a book, or they'll charge you for it on Amazon. I found it to be very, very helpful and thought-provoking. The last chapter, the creative chapter using the screw tape form, was also very clever. So if you're a listener to this podcast, they didn't even ask me to do this. I'm just telling you, I found it really, really encouraging and a lot of fun to engage with. So go get that book.
The link is in the description, and we do charge handsomely for it, but it's our retirement fund depends on it.
They do. Those are really kind words, and we appreciate it. This is suddenly our favorite episode of all time.
Better than sandwich episode? Better than the sandwich episode.
I think our favorite one was when we were driving through Europe. I don't know if you've heard those, but we were actually driving through Switzerland together recording. You might check it out.
If you've ever wanted to know what white knuckling sounds like audio wise, that's your chance, because I'm generally driving through the mountain pass and I'm like, hey, look at the cliffside, and Steve's on the side closing his eyes. And so if you ever want to know what that sounds like from an auditory view,
terrifying.
Well, thank you all so much to echo Estee. Yeah, thank you so much. This is really kind, and really proud of the work that y'all are doing. And thank you so much for the invitation. And you've got at least a couple of new subscribers. So
Love it.
Thanks.
And with that, can't end it better than that. So I shall say adieu to the good Reverends Jason and Estee Valendy from Keller United Methodist Church, and Dr. Bourgeois. I shall say auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.